Well, good morning, everyone, and have I got a treat in store for you today? Are you struggling to make sense of the complexities of two-pot? Where are we with the implementation of this regulation? What are these two pots we keep hearing about? And what will be the tax treatment for these various pots? And how does T-Day affect the two pots? And where are we with seeding? Well, fear not, for today, my friend and colleague Jennifer Anderson and I will be exploring all the ins and outs of this groundbreaking regulatory change to our pension system. I'm Georgina Smith, and it's my privilege to look after the INN8 distribution team. And it's so great to see so many of our advisors online today. 1,200 of you, in fact, which is just brilliant. Thank you. So before we get started, a quick note on CPD. We've applied for CPD accreditation, and this will be awarded automatically via email following the webinar today. For those of you watching the recording of today, there will be questions following the webinar to enable you to claim your CPD. As always, we're happy to take questions via the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to answer them before the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer Anderson, INN8's Head of Product and Communications. She's a regular on our INN8 technical webinars, and it's great to welcome her back into the hot seat. She's the absolute go-to person for my team, and indeed the rest of INN8, on all things to do with regulation and how it will affect advisors and platform providers. So welcome, Jen.
Thanks, George. Thanks for having me.
So, Jen, we're here to talk about probably the most fundamental change to come out of the retirement reform yet. Jen, can you give us some background on how we got here? And this is part of a much wider set of changes, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right, George. And those of the people in our audience that have been listening to these retirement reform webinars for a while will know that we've taken quite a long way to get here. And it all started back in 2012. Where National Treasury released 3 papers. The one that we sort of looking at today was called Enabling a Better Income in Retirement. And out of that discussion paper kind of flowed all of these regulatory changes in the pension fund space, which we've called the retirement reform. The most significant one up to now that people will probably remember is T-Day, which you've mentioned already, which was supposed to go in, I think, in 2017 the first time, very contentiously kind of delayed at the very last minute. And eventually going in after a lot of negotiation in 2021. And now the next one to come down the line, the two-pot regulation, I mean, by far the most transformative change to the retirement fund system, I think, that we've ever seen, which is now kind of what we're looking at as an industry.
And why is this something the government wants to regulate? I mean, surely everyone needs to take responsibility for their own retirement planning, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things at play here. So the first thing is that, as everybody probably on the line will know, when you change jobs, if you're contributing to an employer pension or provident fund, at that resignation event, you get the opportunity to cash out your pension or provident fund savings. And unfortunately, the vast majority of employees are doing that. So stats say only 9% of us are preserving, the other 91% are taking the cash. And that leads to poor retirement outcomes, right? So we're also seeing when people retire, on average, you'd want someone to have around 75% replacement ratio, depending on their circumstances and what debt they still had, etc. In reality, South Africans on average sort of 25 to 30% retirement ratio, so far too low. And a lot of that's because people are biting out of their retirement apple all the way along throughout their career when they change jobs instead of just saving. So that's the one side of the problem, and the government's worried about that, obviously. The other side is that South Africans in general just aren't savers. It's not part of our culture. One could argue that we've got a really high cost of living, so even if it was part of our culture, people just wouldn't have the money to do it. So what that means is there's very little discretionary saving available to most normal people out there. So if an emergency happens, if you need that rainy day money, very few people have actually any kind of savings to fall back on. And the research said 1 in 3 people don't have enough savings to last them a month, which is very scary. So you put those two things together, and the government is very concerned about both of those things, because obviously we're not in a situation to bail out every single person who needs cash.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound a pretty scary picture. So now we've got a really good idea that there's an issue both with retirement savings and day-to-day savings, which is exactly what the two-pot system is trying to address. Isn't that right?
Yes. So in the two-pot system, the government's recognizing that what they call precautionary savings have merit. So they're looking to help households to reduce the risk of an unexpected, need for money and financial hardship that they haven't saved for. But they're trying to do that in a way that people aren't constantly dipping into their retirement systems. So retirement savings, apologies. So there's something in the regulation which I love. I love the way this is worded, and it's that the two-pot system is trying to balance out the two opposing forces of long-term saving and short-term needs, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah, I agree. It's certainly quite progressive for sure. But how does this differ from what we have at the moment?
So as I mentioned a bit earlier, when you change jobs, when you resign, you do get access to your retirement savings in those employer funds if you want to. But the problem goes further than that because people really are desperate for cash. So what we see, and it genuinely is a reality, is that people fall on hard times. They need money. It's for something important, like mom needs a surgery, or the roof is fallen in and you don't have insurance, etc. And they have no savings. So these people are actually resigning from jobs that they're happy in, that they want to stay in, because that's the only way for them to access cash. And the cash that they're accessing is their retirement savings. And then you've got a double-edged sword, right? Now you've dipped into your retirement savings when you shouldn't have, ideally. And also now you don't have a job, because to dip into those retirement savings, you've actually been forced to resign. So it's a really, really sad situation, actually. The converse of that, what two-pot is trying to fix there, is that without dipping into your retirement savings, via that mechanism, via resignation, we're expecting that on average, the average member who starts saving into this two-pot system when they start their career will have about double the retirement savings when they get to retirement. And that's despite the fact that they're going to have access on a regular basis to some of that retirement savings along the way. So a really, really brilliant outcome, I think, in terms of the intention of the regulation. And something quite different to what we see elsewhere in the world, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if I think about the UK, in the UK, you cannot access your pension pot until you're 55, under any circumstances, really. So it really is quite an interesting way of thinking about it. And certainly what we have at the moment drives really bad behavior. People leaving a job just so they can access their retirement savings. I mean, I've had people in my team leave various points because they had to emergency access those retirement savings, and it's just so terribly sad. I mean, groups like ours even have policies where we can't rehire people within 12 months to try and stop that behavior. But listen, Jen, before we get into the detail, I believe there have been a lot of changes coming out of National Treasury on this over the last few weeks. Certainly the press has been filled with what's going to happen. Can you fill us in on what's changed and where we are right now?
Yes, definitely. It's been a busy few weeks for those of us who are eating, living and breathing two-pot. And I think the most important change, so we got a new Revenue Laws Amendment Bill, the RLAB, for those of us who talk in acronyms, that came out a couple of weeks ago, which is the latest draft of the regulation. And the most important change that is proposed in that is a postponement to the implementation date. So originally the effective date, as most people will probably know, was 1st of March 2024. And we're now looking at a new effective date that's been delayed by a year of the 1st of March 2025. And this is a very, very contentious change. So I don't think any of us in the industry are sure that that's the final date that we're looking at. So organized labor are really desperate to give people access to cash as soon as they can. They say people are desperate. So they in particular are really not happy with this postponement of the two-pot date. So I think there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure in the system to see if that can move forward. There is a meeting happening during the course of next week, we believe, where Organised Labour, National Treasury, and some others are going to meet and discuss certain things. And amongst those, I'd imagine they'd be discussing this postponement and the rationale for it, and whether or not that's kind of the final position that we're going to see come out.
And I'm sure in that meeting, Jen, there'll be a lot of people with a lot of different agendas, particularly with the political calendar that we've got facing us in the next year. So it'll be very interesting to see where we end up. But when will we know for sure, Jen?
So I think we all desperately hope we'll know after this meeting, as I say, which is happening during the course of the next week. But the reality is that up until this bill is promulgated and signed off by Parliament, the date could change. So Parliament has that right, so they could get a bill in front of them to sign and approve. And in that, that some sort of signing session, they could actually change the date. So unfortunately, what that means is that we won't know for 100% sure until the promulgation of the regulation, and we're expecting that to only arrive in January next year, which, if you think about a potential March 2024 implementation date, is awfully late. I mean, you don't want to find out in Jan that suddenly you're back on the hook for that year March. So a pretty tricky situation all around.
Yeah, and I think the industry at large, platform providers, advisors, all sorts of different stakeholders have kind of been scrambling to get ready for March 2024 without even the regulation being promulgated. But why has it even been postponed to 2025 in the first place? What's actually driven us to reopen this Pandora's box?
There are a couple of really key things there. So I think the first is it's just a lot of change. There's pretty widespread change required from a retirement fund administration perspective to systems, processes, training that we need to do, as well as, very importantly, every single set of fund rules. And the fund rules are a document that basically are how a retirement fund is incorporated. Every single set of retirement fund rules in South Africa will need to be updated to reflect the two-pot regime. And those rules need to go to the FSCA to review and approve. Technically, until your rules are approved, a retirement fund isn't allowed to operate according to those new rules. So that's a big problem if you think of how many thousands of funds have to funnel through the FSCA approval process. The second issue is that we're working with draft regulation here. And it's very, very difficult to make all of these pretty widespread, expensive, and complex changes when you're working with a draft. And we've seen that now practically between the July draft and the November draft. There have been some really fundamental changes in what the regulation entails. So, to have to make these changes based on a draft really leaves the retirement fund industry in a proper catch-22. Do you take the risk and develop on the draft regulation, knowing that that work might be throwaway costs and time and effort? Or do you wait and hope that the implementation date moves out? And if you're right, then great, you didn't waste any implementation time and money. But if you're wrong, my goodness, then you're really on the back foot, because now you're scrambling for an implementation date that you're not ready for. So that's a big issue. The next issue, which I'm sure all of our advisors on the call today will appreciate, is that member education and sort of training and communication is absolutely critical to get this process right and to land it right with all of the members of these retirement funds that are going to be affected. So, if people don't understand what's happening and they don't understand the implications of the choices they've been given, or the tax in terms of, withdrawals they could take, etc., you could really have a very negative outcome in terms of certainly outcomes for individual members, but I think on a bigger level, on a riskier level, a real sort of erosion of the trust of the average everyday member in their pension fund, firstly, which is where they save, so they really need to trust it, and in the retirement savings industry as a whole. It's really important that we do that carefully. We take the right time to get to the grassroots and have those conversations properly, because panic can happen. And we saw that with T-Day. So when T-Day came out, strangely enough, there was a bit of a rumor that went around that resulted in a lot of teachers resigning from their jobs to access their government employee pension fund money before T-Day came along, which was quite bizarre, because T-Day firstly didn't affect the government employee pension fund at all, and secondly only affected provident funds. So that was just a really good illustration, I think, of how panic can spread, misinformation can spread, and you've really got to be pretty conscientious about how you roll these things out from that perspective. And the last point, George, and I think the straw that probably really broke the camel's back here and secured this postponement to 2025 for now, is that these changes require an awful lot of work from SARS. And I think everybody will see that as we talk through the detail today. But SARS has indicated that they also need time to get ready. And that if they're not ready, this whole thing's going to fall over. As all of our advisors will know, any kind of outflow from a retirement fund typically involves SARS involvement. So they're really the linchpin that sits at the sort of center of the system. And if they're not ready, if they fall over on this day, the day this thing launches, it's going to be an absolute disaster for everybody. So that I think is also a really key reason kind of feeding into this postponement that we've seen come through now.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are various stakeholders on this call here, and certainly as a platform provider, it's been incredibly complex and time consuming to go through, obviously, with a fine tooth comb and implement this, because it affects so many parts of a platform's investment processes. So it was hard enough for us. It's going to be very, very hard for SARS. So and add on the education piece as well. It does feel like we're not really ready to go in June. But let's get into the detail, Jen. How is this all going to work? I've seen a couple of questions come in, people asking some really detailed questions. What's going to be the drawdown? Let's get into that detail. Shall we throw a slide up, Jen?
Yes, let's put a slide up. I think that'll help us talk through all the detail. All right, so if we start on the left-hand side of the slide, what we can see is all new contributions from the implementation date are going to be split into two new pots, the retirement component and the savings component. And 2/3 of all of your new contributions are going to go into the retirement component, and 1/3 into the savings component. And yes, we're talking about components now. The language has changed from pots just to keep us all on our toes. So it's the retirement component and the savings component.
And what are the rules relating to these two components, Jen?
The retirement component is very restrictive. So that's intended strictly and only to use for the member to buy an annuity at retirement. So what does that mean? It means you can't withdraw from this pot at all. Not when you resign, not if you preserve the money, and typically in a preservation fund, you get access to one withdrawal. You can't do that. And not when you retire. So even at the retirement point, you're not going to get access to this part of your retirement savings in cash. That is solely intended to buy an annuity at retirement. At the moment, you also can't access any of this money if you're retrenched, so you lose your job via that mechanism, although I know that's something that National Treasury is looking at, and potentially that's going to be adjusted in the future.
So then what about the savings component, Jen? How does that work?
So this part of your savings is the flexible component. So members are going to be able to withdraw up to the entire balance in this portion of their retirement savings once every tax year. So that's important, 1st of March to 28th of Feb. And that withdrawal has to be a minimum amount of 2,000 Rand.
But why the 2,000 Rand? Why is that rule in place?
That's a really practical rule, I think, and it's just to prevent a whole bunch of really silly small withdrawal requests coming at these retirement fund administrators. And I mean, after all, they're certainly not set up to run like a bank account or as a banking provider. So I think just providing that floor of a minimum just prevents people coming along and saying, oh, I want to buy an extra pack of cigarettes this week, and I want to withdraw 50 Rand from my savings component, etc. So I think it's just a practical reason there.
And are there any other rules for this component?
Yes, a couple. So if you have multiple accounts in one retirement fund, so I think that's quite common if you've changed jobs a few times and you've been good and you've preserved, you might have a couple of preservation fund accounts in the same retirement fund, or potentially retirement annuity accounts, and you'll be able to withdraw from each account separately. So it's not looked at a client level or a fund level. It's looked at an account level, or what the regulation calls a contract level. So you'll be able to take a withdrawal per tax year from each of those accounts individually if you want to. Also, which is quite interesting, is let's say you are in an employer fund, so you're at a job, you take your savings component withdrawal for the year, so in that tax year, let's say in April of the year, and then you resign, you change jobs and you preserve that money. After you've preserved that money, you'll be allowed to take another withdrawal from that savings component in the same tax year. So it doesn't work the same way that the preservation fund logic works, where, as I'm sure you know, George, let's say you've got a preservation fund at platform A, and you've already taken your one withdrawal there, and then you move that preservation fund investment to INN8, you don't get another bite of the cherry in terms of that one withdrawal. So the savings component works differently. And I think that's probably just for practical reasons, that it's easier to administer, and you were going to get another withdrawal next tax year anyway. So it's not sort of material in terms of your outcomes. Last thing to note is any withdrawals from your savings component don't contribute towards your lifetime limits. So that's the tax-free limit when you cash out money at retirement. So that 550,000 Rand that you get tax-free for all withdrawals before or at retirement that exists currently, that won't include any withdrawals from your savings component, which is nice because it means you can kind of withdraw without affecting your retirement planning from that perspective.
Jen, I'm seeing a lot of compliments and questions come in about the slide. Yes, we will be sharing the slide afterwards via an email. Don't worry, we'll definitely be able to share this. I'm glad you're finding it so useful. And there's a question here about whether there's a recording. Yes, there will be a recording. It comes out about a week after the live event today. So Jen, let's just go back to that savings component just for a moment. How is that going to be taxed?
So from the beginning, all of the drafts and the regulation discussion documents have said this savings component withdrawal is going to be taxed at the member's marginal tax rate, meaning that they add that money that you withdraw onto your taxable income for that tax year, and you fall somewhere in the normal PAYE tax tables, and that's where you'll be taxed. How that's going to be achieved from an administrative perspective has been a very, very contentious point in the regulation, and remains a contentious point even in the latest draft. So from the beginning, what the industry has been saying to National Treasury and to SARS is we can't manage these savings pot withdrawals on a tax directive methodology basis. So for all of our advisors on the call, they probably already know, if you currently do a withdrawal from a retirement fund, the administrator of that investment will contact SARS. They'll let SARS know what withdrawal is taking place. SARS will assess that member and send back how much tax the administrator needs to withhold from the withdrawal. And that's kind of the normal process. But because we're expecting so many of these savings pot withdrawals, firstly, and secondly, because the timing when you can take a withdrawal is the tax year, it means we're going to have an influx, an inundation of withdrawals every year around the 1st of March. I always think of the Black Friday, images you see in the States of people with their faces squished up against the glass of the shop, waiting for the shop door to open. I think some of our retirement fund administrators feel like they are those shopkeepers when it comes to this. We're expecting an enormous amount of withdrawals. So to go to SARS for every single one, the industry is saying too time consuming, not necessarily practical. For SARS or for the administrators. So in the latest draft, which we got a few weeks ago, there has been a change to that. And the draft is now saying that SARS is going to provide a fixed tax rate for every member that represents what they should be charged from a marginal tax rate perspective, and that the retirement fund administrator can just apply that tax rate when they get a savings pot withdrawal request from that member.
And do you think this is a better way to approach it, Jen?
So it's definitely better in that doing it this way means that administrators won't need to go through SARS for every withdrawal that they process. They can just take this rate and they can apply it. And SARS doesn't need to be involved in the day-to-day. So that's obviously better in terms of a strain on SARS, and quicker and easier for administrators. So probably a better outcome for clients because they can get money quicker, and certainly less work from an administration perspective. It does represent quite a big change in the sort of practical taxation process for retirement savings. So I'd imagine for quite a lot of retirement fund administrators, it's quite a lot of work to implement something like this. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, and I think this is the commentary we're now seeing trickling in off the back of this latest draft from the industry, there are lots of questions about whether practically this is actually going to be something that SARS can do. So practically, are they able, firstly, to know who a member is of every retirement fund in the country? That may be fairly easy, one could argue, for employer funds, but potentially less easy in the retail space. Secondly, are they in a position to know what rates to apply to that client for the current tax year? not necessarily knowing, all the income the client is receiving, et cetera, et cetera. So also practical questions around, if we get a new member in and let's say they're contributing discretionary money into a retirement annuity, SARS won't know that that member is a member necessarily by the time that member asks to withdraw. So I think the intention is very good. We're definitely moving in the right direction. And I mean, National Treasury has been really, really good about kind of listening to the industry and consultation. But yeah, I think some devil in the detail that we still need to work through there.
Yeah, it does really count really when you get right into the detail of this, and I think you've raised some really useful and interesting questions there. I'm sure it'll all come out when it gets promulgated. But what happens to your savings component when you retire, Jen? There's a couple of questions that have come in around that. Let's talk about what happens to that savings component.
Sure. So that component is always cashable at retirement. So let's say you have taken a savings component withdrawal in that tax year and then you retire. You're still going to be able to take anything left in that savings pot at retirement in cash. If you don't want to do that, you're also going to be allowed to transfer that savings component money into your retirement components and then annuitize it. And you could do that in part or full. So it's pretty flexible from that perspective. What is nice is that if you withdraw from your savings component at retirement, so it's a retirement cash commutation event, that withdrawal will be taxed at the retirement lump sum tax tables. It won't be taxed at your marginal tax rate. So if we imagine that for a lot of people, those retirement lump sum tax tables are probably a lower rate than their marginal tax rate. And also you've got the 550,000 tax-free that I mentioned earlier. You can imagine for a lot of members, they pay less tax if they're cashed out at retirement rather than before retirement. And SARS and National Treasury have done that very deliberately. They're trying to incentivize people to hang on. If it's not really an emergency, please don't cash out from your savings component. Hang on in there, cash it out at retirement and use it for something, something sensible like, paying off the rest of the debt on your house or something so that you're ready for your retirement journey.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of questions come in and comments from people saying, but we're educating people not to touch their pension money, and now they're able to. But of course, here's the incentive that they're putting in place to try and incentivize people not to touch that savings pot if they really don't have to. So Jen, what happens to the money you've saved up until the two-pot implementation date? Does it retain its rights as it is now? I mean, this sounds like it could be very complex.
It is unfortunately fairly complex, but we'll get through it together. So
Great.
There's a principle in I think in law in general, but certainly in the kind of regulatory law, that we don't want to take the rights away from members that they've had up until this point. And that's where the concept of vesting comes in. And we've seen this, play out in a few areas. So grandfathering for Regulation 28 is a great example. If you were sort of outside the Regulation 28 bands when Regulation when Reg 28 came in 2011, you got to retain that right. And we saw that again with T-Day, and that's where the vested benefits came in versus the non-vested benefits where, your old Provident Fund money retained all of its rights. And we're doing the same thing again here. So any money that you've saved before the two-pot implementation date is going to retain the rights it has now. And collectively, that's being called the vested component. So if anybody's feeling particularly excited, they can go and read the RLAB, the draft. You'll see it's referred to as the vested component there. That actually consists of two parts. It consists of your vested benefit, which is your Provident Fund contributions from before T-Day, before the 1st of March 2021, which you can cash out in full at retirement. And then it's the second part of that vested component is your non-vested benefit, which is all your other contributions, including Provident Fund contributions from T-Day till two-pot day, so March 2021 until the two-pot implementation dates. And for those, you can withdraw up to a max of a third at retirement. So those rights remain. And also in terms of pre-retirement withdrawals, you'll be able to do with this component as you have done up to now. So if you resign, you can access this vested component in full, in cash. Obviously, it's taxed, but that's still available to you. If you're in a preservation fund, you would still have access to your one withdrawal before retirement. So all of those rights are going to be retained.
So I think we can probably take down the slide now. But goodness me, Jen, if our listeners and viewers today weren't already members of Mensa, I think after it being able to implement this, they really should apply, because it really does sound very complex, Jen.
Unfortunately, it is fairly complex, but I think it's, you definitely get used to it. And I can certainly say for those of us who've been working closely with it as these drafts have rolled out, you do wrap your mind around it, and like everything else, you just got to try and keep it simple as much as you can, so that members can really, understand what's going on and what really matters to them. So, for example, at retirement, you don't necessarily need to tell a member, this is your vested bit and your non-vested and your savings and your retirement. You can really tell them something simple. How much can you cash out? How much do you have to annuitize? And at the end of the day, those are the outcomes that members are looking at. So I think there are clever ways to try and keep it simple, while there is all of this sort of devil in the detail under the hood.
Yeah, you're probably right. Actually, I remember when T-Day came in, we were quite, we were quite sort of blinded by that a little bit for a while, and actually, it's been quite straightforward really when you start working with it. So Jen, let's talk about immigration. How will immigration work when it comes to all these changes, Jen?
So there's also vesting of rights in the immigration space. So what that means is, if you've got a member and they're in an employer fund and they resign because they're immigrating, they're moving offshore, they can take their one withdrawal, pay the lump sum tax on it, and access that money and take it with them as part of a resignation withdrawal. Similarly, if they're in a preservation fund and they've still got their one withdrawal left, they could use their one withdrawal and use that to access their money. If clients are either in a retirement annuity fund or they're in a preservation fund and they've already taken their one withdrawal, that vested money, so the vested benefit, non-vested benefits, that will have to go through what we call the 3-year rule. So everyone on the call will probably know a member would have to become a non-resident from a tax perspective, so non-South African tax resident. And once they've been a non-SA tax resident for at least 3 years, they can ask for an immigration related full withdrawal from that vested component, and that also would be subject to tax.
And then with these 2 new pots that come in, how will immigration work for them?
So the retirement component, obviously, because that's pretty restrictive, there's no way to access that other than the 3-year rule. So anybody who's immigrating would have to go through the tax exit process and then wait, a minimum of 3 years after that process is complete to then ask to take an immigration related withdrawal from their retirement component. For the savings component, there's actually no need for any kind of law related to immigration, and we've seen that coming through in the drafts, because the savings component is pretty liquid. So if you immigrate and you haven't taken your savings component withdrawal this tax year, you can simply take it as you always would. It will be taxed at your marginal tax rates and off you go. If you've already done a withdrawal in this tax year, you can immigrate, and then after you've immigrated in the new South African tax year, you can simply do a full withdrawal from the savings component at that point. So I think this raises an interesting point, and it's something for our advisors to just think about, is that I think you're going to see, if someone immigrates and they're in an employer fund, they're going to take their vested money, their old money that they can take when they resign, that's going to go with them. They're going to take their savings component, as soon as they can, either in this tax year or the next, and they're going to be left with this retirement component that has to hang around for a minimum of 3 years. So, I think we are going to see certainly an increased use of preservation funds in that space, because I'd imagine the employer that you are resigning from doesn't necessarily want your retirement component hanging around when you're not an employee. So I think an opportunity for advisors and maybe an opportunity to open up that conversation with clients about, should you really be cashing everything out when you leave? And I know we've had a few webinars on that already this year. But yeah, that's how the immigration space is going to work.
Okay, so that's cleared that piece up. Now let's have a chat about what we're reading a lot about in the media, about members getting immediate access to money when 2-pot is implemented. Is that true?
This part of the regulation has been contentious from the beginning, and it's something that I think both National Treasury and the sort of industry, by and large, we're fairly cautious about and pretty nervous about. But something obviously that organized labor and the average employee out there were very much in favor of, particularly given that we've got a really high cost of living at the moment. etc. So it is coming to pass. It is true. It's known as seeding. So if anybody's reading the articles on this, you'll see talk about a seeding event. And basically what's going to happen is on the implementation date of two-pot. So as it stands now, 1st of March 2025, 10% of a member's retirement savings, your existing savings you've saved already, are going to be moved into your savings component. That's up to a maximum of 30,000 Rand. So it's 10% or 30,000 Rand, whichever is more, or less, excuse me, whichever is less. Let's not get everyone excited. That will move immediately into your savings component and be available for immediate withdrawal on the day that the two-pot regulation goes live.
Oof, I can understand this being contentious. What do you think are the reasons this made it into the regulations, Jen?
So I think these regulations from the beginning have been a balancing act. And it's obviously a lot to ask people who are used to, when times get tough, I'm going to resign and access all this pension money. It's quite a tough sell to say, look, I'm going to take that away from you for all your new savings. You're going to get a third that you can access once a year, but the rest of it's kind of, you've got to be disciplined and wait for retirement. So I think there was, a lot of back and forth and negotiation in terms of, well, if you're taking something away, what are you going to give? And I think that's, how the whole savings component thinking came to be. In terms of the seeding specifically, this conversation first started sort of coming about straight after COVID, where things were very tough. And that's when this sort of regulation was first sort of popping up in discussions. And, it was really a recognition that people had a tough time. COVID made something, made a tough situation even tougher for people. And that people needed immediate access, and to slowly build up the savings component over time probably wasn't going to be an enormous help to people who are really struggling now. Obviously, quite a populist move from organised labour and others. They certainly are going to make their members very, very pleased when members get a bite out of their cherry, seemingly, money for nothing almost on the implementation of two-pot. And what's interesting to note, George, is that obviously there's been a lot of back and forth on this part of the change. And there was a lot of talk about whether the 25,000 Rand, because originally the amount was 10% or 25,000 Rand. There was a lot of talk that the 25,000 Rand was too low. There was a lot of negotiation. I think someone proposed 500,000 Rand, which I found very fun. There was 50,000 Rand proposed, et cetera, et cetera. And now we've seen in the latest draft this amount of 30,000 Rand or 10%, whichever is less. And I find that very interesting, because that won't necessarily, that change from 25,000 to 30,000 won't necessarily help people with a small pension. So probably people who we'd imagine are struggling the most, because they're going to hit the 10% cap. If their total pension savings is 250,000 Rand or less, the fact that the 25,000 went to 30 is going to be immaterial to them, because they're still going to hit the 10% and only get 25,000. So really, really interesting that the 10% stayed 10%, but the 25,000 went to 30.
So apart from all the administration that's going to have to go in around this seeding part, this is going to feel like a windfall for a lot of people. Where is all this money going to go, Jen?
I mean, this topic is absolutely fascinating. I've been asking around, I've been getting a lot of opinions, and the reality is nobody knows, but it's certainly going to be fascinating to observe. And I mean, we're expecting a lot of people to be fairly sensible and to take this money and to use it to pay off some of their debt, which is obviously a very worthwhile use of their funds, probably worth an emergency withdrawal from your retirement savings, which is what the savings component is supposed to be all about. We have seen some talk calling this money a 13th check, which, I think it sounds glamorous and glorious, but, that really isn't the intention. As you mentioned earlier, this money is still primarily meant for your retirement. It's meant to look after you when you can't work anymore, but with an understanding that life happens sometimes, and maybe you'll need money along the way. So, that rhetoric's definitely out there. I think, again, speaks to why member education is so critical. On the other side of the coin, on this debate, there's a lot of work going into the asset management side of the industry, where obviously all of this money sits, to make sure that they're ready for the seeding event, where we're going to see an enormous amount of money flowing out of the system. So they're making sure they're going to have enough liquidity to be able to handle all these withdrawals, and also that it's not going to place any undue pressure on the market when we see this sort of outflow taking place. And just to give everybody on the webinar with us an idea, one of the biggest retirement fund administrators in South Africa has said they are expecting 1 million withdrawals on the day this is implemented. So that is 1 million withdrawals accessing the savings component to withdraw that seeding amount. So absolutely incredible volumes that we're expecting, and that's just one administrator. So you can imagine, if you extend that to the entire South African retirement landscape, just incredible to think about.
Yeah, hold on to your horses there. I think, my goodness, that's going to be quite a difficult thing to administrate, but I'm sure we'll be ready. And of course, it'll be really interesting to see what the economists kind of think of this after the event and how this kind of tracks through in our economy as well. But Jen, remind me, are these changes going to apply to all retirement funds out there?
That's a good question. Yes. So by and large, yes, they are, including both defined benefit and defined contribution funds, which I think is going to be tricky. So obviously for us, defined contribution funds, it's simpler. For a defined benefit fund to manage a change like this is quite a lot more complex, but yes, it does apply to them. There are exceptions of some legacy retirement annuity funds, funds that have all sorts of weird and wonderful bells and whistles that it just was felt, those funds are kind of, I think, close to new business and, just don't lend themselves to this kind of change. Also sensible exclusion. So unclaimed benefit funds, beneficiary funds, if you have a fund that doesn't have any members and is being wound up, all kinds of sensible restrictions have been asked for, and we're seeing those starting to come through in the latest draft bill. What is quite notable is that the government employee pension fund is included. I find that really, really interesting and actually a really, really positive development. So why that's interesting is, for anyone who doesn't know, the GEPF sits outside of the Pension Funds Act, so they're governed by a different set of regulations. And that means that regulatory changes like this don't always apply to the GEPF. They're not just automatically applied. But the GEPF is by a mile, the largest pension fund in South Africa. So it's obviously managing money on behalf of all the government employees in South Africa. So over 1.2 million members from over 300 government departments, and more than 2 trillion in assets or benefits under management inside that GEPF. So I think the fact that they've been included is a really, really positive change, because Two-Pot is genuinely intended to be for the good of members and the good of employees. So I think the fact that we're catching all of those government employees in the net as well is really a good thing. But I'd imagine an enormous amount of work for the GEPF to prepare for as well. I'm not sure how many of those 1.2 million members are going to be asking for their savings component withdrawal on the implementation date. So that's also something to watch.
And of course, the GEPF is a defined benefit fund. So if you're an actuary working in that space at the moment, you must be pulling your hair out, I should imagine, trying to plan for withdrawals and the defined benefits. And my goodness, that's definitely an area I'd be steering clear of, I think, in my next life.
Maybe they build by the hour, George, and then they're very happy with this change.
Maybe they are. Maybe they are. So Jen, are there any other exemptions we should be aware of?
Yes. So members of a provident fund, so not a provident preservation fund, just a provident fund, who were over 55 when T-Day came out. So 1st of March 2021, not when Two-Pot's coming out, when T-Day came out, are exempt from the Two-Pot changes. So their contributions will continue to go into the non-vested benefit portion of their retirement savings. And that only applies if they're still in the same provident fund as they were when T-Day came out, so the 1st of March 2021. They can opt into this Two-Pot system if they want to. So if they say, hey, this looks great, I'd like to start having my contributions go into retirements and savings component, they can ask to do that, but by default they'll be exempted. So I find this very, very interesting, because practically it means, from a member perspective, these Two-Pot changes are going to apply to everybody else. So let's say you are in a pension fund and you are 63, so very close to retirement. your money, your new contributions are going to start to be split, retirement component and savings component. So it's slightly different. We've seen the kind of exceptions previously be anybody who was 55 and up on the implementation date. This is slightly different. So I think it's something really important for all of our advisors to just factor in. I know a lot of you looking after clients that are approaching their retirement, that are actively planning their retirement. This is just something to note, to just check, what's going to go into which portion, and how that gets taxed and what their rights and restrictions are around that. I think that's quite important.
Yes, you're right, Jen. It is a slight change in if you like, the kind of principles of implementation versus other changes. All I can say is it feels incredibly complex at the moment, don't you think?
Yes, I think it is. And I think, as we've mentioned, quite a lot for members to get to grip with. But I mean, one thing we can say is that the complexity isn't intentional. I think that's the first thing. And it's temporary. So if you imagine that we have a young'un who joins the employment force after two-pot comes into effect, their lives will be fairly simple. They'll have contributions, and a third they could access every year if they have an emergency. The other 2/3 just chugs away, and gradually it builds up over time. They need to keep it saved up, and when they retire, they're going to use that to help them obtain an income in retirement. So over time, as we work the vested and non-vested benefits out of the system, as all of those members age and retire, it will get simpler and simpler. Unfortunately, we're living through the pain to get us to that point. And I can't see any other way that we could have done it. It would have been totally unfair to take away vested rights from members. But yes, it does mean that there are these kind of 4 different buckets of money that we've got to understand, that we've got to manage, that we've got to take into account when we do financial planning, etc. But also that we've got to explain to members, and that's we've got to be really careful that we make sure people know what they've got sitting where, what their rights are, what their restrictions are. So that everybody, is 100% comfortable with what's going on with their money, because that's absolutely vital.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a reporting perspective and client statement perspective, I think it'll be quite interesting how different institutions cater for this. Don't you think, Jen?
Yes, spot on, 100%.
So Jen, I think that brings us sort of to the end of our conversation, but we have got a ton of questions that have come in around this, which I absolutely expected. Let's start with a few easy ones. Robin, hi Robin, nice to see you online. Thanks so much. He says, is there any maximum in the amount which can be taken from the savings component in a year?
Good question. Thanks, Robert. No, there's no maximum. So let's say you've got, very lucky fish, you've got R1 million sitting in your savings components. You can take that entire amount in that tax year if you want to. Just keep in mind that it's going to be taxed, as we mentioned. But yeah, no maximum. Good question. Thank you.
Okay, cool. And Ursula says, how is the cash in the cash component? How is the cash in the cash component invested? Because I assume you cannot put it in long-term investment funds.
That's also an excellent question. So I think that question also speaks to Reg 28 to an extent. So National Treasury has said there's no reason to amend Reg 28 in relation to this two-part regulation. And I think that's quite right, because regulation works on percentages, and this two-part regime also works on percentages. So a percentage of a percentage will always give you the same outcome. I think what the question alludes to, though, is, are members going to be able to choose different assets or different portfolios to invest in their savings component versus their retirement component? And that's an excellent question. So I think the first thing is that, yes, Regulation 28 still applies. So as a whole, your benefit would need to comply with Reg 28. The second thing is that the regulation is never going to be prescriptive to the extent that it's going to say you can't invest in the same assets, or you have to invest in different assets, etc. We certainly haven't seen anything like that coming through in the drafts. And in my experience, typically that level of detail isn't included in the sort of tax and revenue law amendment bill types of regulation. It might come through as a guidance note from the pension fund regulator. But there is the option, I suppose, in the law as it stands, is not prevented to say you could invest in something different in the savings component and the retirement component. However, I think you're going to see very, very few, if any, retirement fund boards of trustees really wanting to offer that to members. And you can imagine the fallout. So let's say I choose, a more risky asset for my savings component than I do for my retirement component, in the hope that I get more growth and more money that I can withdraw pre-retirement, and my strategy doesn't work out, and my money tanks in my savings component. Can you imagine the complaint from a member in that scenario? So I do think there's risk. I think it makes it more complicated for members. I certainly can't see a lot of employer funds wanting to introduce that level of complexity into their environments, but never say never. And I think that's what's fascinating about this regulation. We don't even know, for example, are people going to house all of these different pots in one account, or are they going to be in many accounts? If they're in many accounts, how are you going to consolidate reporting? There's all sorts of things like that, that I think it is a bit of a wait and see what everybody does. But that's an excellent question. And I mean, technically, as the law sits now, there'd be nothing preventing you from investing in a different asset in your savings component to the portfolio that you're selecting in your retirement component or in your vested component. Great question. Thank you.
That's okay. Question here, does the 550k tax-free come from the savings or the retirement pot?
So the retirement pot, you can't cash out at retirement, so that wouldn't come into play there. It'll come from a combination of your vested money, so your vested component and your savings component. So inside the vested component, any vested benefits from your provident fund, you can still cash out in full at retirement. Non-vested benefits, you can cash out a third. And now anything left in your savings component, you can cash out in full as well. And that handy diagram we showed earlier has a summary of that, which should help us all remember that. So anything that you cash out in retirement, so that you want to take as a cash lump sum at retirement, is going to get accounted for in that 550,000. Also, any pre-retirement withdrawals you did from the vested component is also going to count towards that amount.
Okay. Thanks, Jen. And Brett just wants us to confirm something. He's given us a scenario here. So he says, if over time, some people will build up more than 2/3 of their total funds in their retirement pot, this would then buy an annuity. In the past, you would have the option of 1/3 cash. So if your cash portion is less than 1/3 of your total funds, will you still get access to the 2/3 pot to make up the old 1/3 pot cash portion, or is that just bad luck? Oh, Jen, I think we've lost you for a moment. Are you back?
I hope I'm back. I think my internet.
Yes, you're back.
Oh, thank goodness.
I
thought you were trying to think of a witty joke.
I was actually thinking about a joke, but anyway, there we go. We're back in the room. Did you hear the question, Jen?
I didn't, and I'm so sorry for that. And I'm getting a warning. My internet's not that stable, so let's just hold thumbs and hope I'm still with you.
We've got 8 minutes. 8 minutes for that internet to last. Okay. So this question from Brett. If over time, some people will build up more than 2/3 of their total funds in their retirement pot, and this would then buy an annuity. In the past, you have the option of 1/3 cash. So if your cash portion is now less than 1/3 of your total funds, will you still get access to the 2/3 pot to make up the old 1/3 cash portion? Or is it just bad luck? You can't get access to it?
Just bad luck. And that savings component could very well be less than the third, because people will have been dipping into it. Hopefully not. And please, let's all be disciplined. This is for emergencies. This isn't for buying your next BMW. But yeah, I mean, people are going to be pulling out of that savings component. So one would expect just from that for the 1/3, 2/3 to have gone out of proportion. And the other thing, as per our other question, is if, and I say if, I think it's unlikely, if people were able to and did choose to invest in different portfolios in each of the components, the performance differential could also mean you don't have 1/3 and 2/3 left. So no, at retirement, whatever's in your retirement component, you have to annuitize. Whatever's in your savings component, you can still cash out if you want to. If you have nothing in your savings component because you did a full withdrawal just before you retired, sorry, no more cash at retirement. Nothing from the retirement component.
Thank you for that. Jen, this is a kind of a more holistic question, if you like. Has there been a calculation of the expected quantum of tax revenue generated by this new system versus the old system? Could this not be a further action by government to prop up the fiscus more than the pre-pot implementation periods?
Oh my goodness, that's an amazing question. Yeah, thank you for that question. I certainly haven't seen any calculations. I would imagine calculations have been done just to make sure there's no deficit there. But I certainly don't think that there's any nefarious intent on the behalf of National Treasury here. And if we think about the people they're trying to help, they're not necessarily trying to help the clients of all the advisors that are on the line today who are sort of, affluent or high net worth clients. They're probably not going to need to dip into these savings, one would hope. They're trying to help the man on the streets and the woman on the streets who really are, they really are struggling and they just don't have any other savings. And I mean, the marginal tax rate for those members for a savings withdrawal is not particularly meaningful. So, I don't think that this is an attempt to gather more tax. I do think that there were suggestions that savings component withdrawals were tax-free. I think that was quite a popular suggestion that I saw in some of my reading, and that's not going to happen. Firstly, because I think it would leave SARS, with less tax revenue than they usually have, but also secondly, that drives the totally wrong behavior. We're still trying to disincentivize people from taking that savings component withdrawal. Only take it if you absolutely need it. That's sort of the message that we're going with.
Jen, we've seen quite a few questions about the yearly withdrawal on that savings component. Obviously, we spoke about the seeding, and that's got the maximum 10% or the 30,000 that we talked about. But actually, in that savings pot, is there a maximum that you're able to withdraw, or can you withdraw the whole pot, whatever's saved there?
So I think that's similar to the question we had from Robin in the beginning. You can take up to everything. And I think people find that a bit too good to be true, because I get lots of questions about that. So let's say you've got, 500,000 Rand in that savings pot. You can withdraw it all, or you can withdraw a smaller amount, provided that it's more than 2,000 Rand. Keeping in mind that after the seeding event, that savings pot's going to sort of build up more slowly for people that are in funds where they're contributing, so employer funds or retirement annuity funds. And for preservation funds, I find that savings component quite interesting, because it's going to get kind of seeded with the seeding money, and then that's it, because you can't contribute to a preservation fund. So, that savings component will only grow in terms of, market growth. It's never going to get more contributions going into it.
So Jen, I think it's worth just going back maybe to the stats that we were talking about, that you were talking about at the beginning of the webinar, because Sean, I think he raises a very good question here. He says, in reality, the two-pot still gives access to the 1/3 portion of pension assets. How does this fix a low contribution rate in the SA investors, which is already insufficient? Aren't resignations overstated as a quantum, or is this more politically driven, perhaps?
That's a great question. So if we think about what happens when somebody retires, they get access to when somebody resigns, so they leave their job, they get access to everything in cash. And I certainly think that we're being quite naive if we think that people are cashing it out, only spending 1/3 of it and putting the other 2/3, into discretionary savings or into a preservation fund. We know they're not doing that. They're taking absolutely everything they have and spending it. So this prevents that. So it's really saying that, and I think it was Sean who asked the question, 100% right. You've always had 1/3 available in cash when you retire. What this is saying now is you can have that 1/3 before you retire if you need it, but it's ensuring that the other 2/3 isn't available for anything other than retirement. Whereas previously, let's say you've worked somewhere for a long time, you've worked for a company for 20 years, you've built up, the bulk of your retirement savings, and you resign, you can access 100%, and then you're starting from zero. So that's how it's intended to solve, is it's intended to protect that 2/3 from resignation. And I mean, we've seen the stats. So there's great statistics that come out. There's a couple of companies that have really good annual surveys and reports, Alexander Forbes, Sanlam Benchmark Survey, and the stats are real. 91% of people who resign will cash out their entire pension fund and spend it. So we have those stats. Those are from massive kind of employer fund environments that have a lot of data to lend to the discussion. Yeah, very sad, but unfortunately that is a reality.
Thank you, Jen. One last question. It's come up a couple of times. This feels like an awful lot of implementation for providers, administrators, particularly. Are costs going to go up from those administrators?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I can certainly agree with the question that the costs to implement this have been significant. Just looking across our implementation and the others that we hear about, absolutely massive, not just in IT spend, but in bums on seats. I mean, imagine a million withdrawals. Either you've got to find a way to automate that, or if you're trying to still do a portion of that manually, you've got to employ a host of people, potentially only temporarily for those couple of months of the year to manage that. So the cost of this is extreme. I really hope that we don't see those costs passed on to members. I can certainly say in our space, there's no intention to do that. But I can't speak for the wider industry. I think potentially there is opportunity in the regulation to charge a member when they do a withdrawal from their savings component. I can't recall off the top of my head. But I mean, either the cost has got to be absorbed or it's got to be passed on. So I think, we've an amazing question today. That's a really good question. I think employer funds, I think they'll also try their level best not to pass cost on to their employees, but we'll have to wait and see. Yeah,
absolutely. Jen, thank you very much. It just remains for me to remind the audience that on the 21st of November, Lee Kohler from INN8 Invest will be joined by Cherie Dyer, CEO of Prescient Asset Management, and Derek Masibi, CEO of Standard Asset Management, and Bradley Anthony, MD of Fairtree Asset Management, to find out how they've successfully navigated their respective businesses despite a turbulent market conditions and difficult operating environments. And then on the 1st of December, Jen, you're back in the hot seat. You're going to be talking your second immigration webinar. If you missed the first one, it's on our INN8 Connect website. Follow the links in the page there. This is webinar number 2, and it's going to be on immigration. And this time it's going to be with Kobus Kruger, and you're going to be focusing on tax. And then finally, don't miss our newsletter that comes out. The Scoop is coming out tomorrow. It will be packed with all sorts of interesting content that we share with you every month. So thank you very much for joining the two of us today. We've really enjoyed your engagement and your questions. The recording will be available in about a week, so watch out for that on the website as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
INN8 is a registered trademark of Stanlib Wealth Management Pty Limited, an authorised financial services provider.